was July 19, 2025, deep in a quiet stretch of Alaskan wilderness, near a riverside camp surrounded by tall spruce trees and cold running water. Morning mist floated low over the creek, blurring the rocks and hiding most of the forest beyond the tree line. The Lewis family had camped there for 2 days, enjoying the stillness of the wild. Eric Lewis and his wife were near the tents, packing supplies and preparing to leave before the afternoon sun made the river currents stronger. Their children played near the shallow creek, tossing small stones and following the little trails of water weaving between mossy rocks. Their youngest, Emma Lewis, was only 8 years old. She loved exploring creeks and catching the tiny silver fish that flashed in the cold shallows. Her older brother stayed farther upstream, while she crouched near a bend in the creek, tracing lines through the wet sand with her fingers. The air smelled of damp soil and river water, mixed with the faint scent of fish drifting down from upstream spawning grounds. It was a calm and ordinary morning, pale, still, and quiet. The parents moved steadily through their tasks, folding tarps and checking gear. The forest remained motionless except for the faint rustle of mist between the branches. But the scent of salmon had spread far beyond the creek, carried by the damp morning air. Deep within the trees, a massive brown bear moved slowly toward the riverbank. It was one of the largest land predators in the region, capable of weighing more than a small vehicle. Its fur glistened with morning moisture as it followed the scent trail, stepping quietly through the tall ferns. Emma stayed near the water, unaware of what approached. The forest gave no warning, no crack of branches, no growl, only silence. Then the bear broke through the tree line with startling force, its enormous body towering above the brush. The ground seemed to tremble beneath its weight. It didn't roar or charge wildly. It simply advanced with terrifying purpose toward the creek, driven by the smell of food. Emma turned and froze. The bear lunged forward, its heavy paw smashing into the ground and sending mud and creek water flying. Its massive body brushed against her as it pushed past the rocks. She fell hard into the wet stones, pain flashing through her leg as a claw sliced along her lower thigh, leaving a deep, burning wound. Her scream tore through the still air, echoing across the camp. Before anyone could reach her, the bear kicked through overturned rocks and scattered fish remains along the bank, its breath heavy and steaming in the mist. It moved dangerously close to her limp body as the family reacted in horror. Emma lay stunned on the wet stones as the enormous bear paused near the creek, its chest rising and falling with slow, heavy breaths. Mud and water splashed around its paws, and its dark fur was streaked with river debris. It lowered its head, sniffing at the scattered fish along the bank. The forest was silent, except for Emma's quick, panicked breaths and the fading echo of her scream through the mist. Eric Lewis raced from the camp toward the creek, instincts overtaking fear. He snatched a roadside emergency flare from his gear pile and sprinted across the uneven ground. The bear was still moving along the creekside, brushing past stones and pushing through shredded brush, each step sending ripples across the water. As it turned slightly toward Emma again, searching for the strongest scent, Eric acted without hesitation. He ignited the flare, sparks bursting into the fog like red fireflies. The bright flame cut through the gray air. The light and sound made the bear hesitate mid-step. It stood still, head raised, assessing the new threat. Its massive shoulders rippled as it shifted its stance, mud dripping from its paws. For a long, breathless moment, it stared through the haze, muscles tensed and ready to strike. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, it turned away. The bear backed into the brush, eyes fixed on the glowing light. Its huge body vanished step by step into the mist, each movement deliberate and silent. Only the faint rustle of ferns and a soft tremor in the water marked its retreat into the forest. The danger had passed, but the creekside looked as if a storm had struck. Rocks were overturned, wet sand torn apart, fish remains streaked across the stones, and branches snapped under the animal's weight. Emma's leg bled heavily from the long gash, her skin pale and eyes wide with shock. Fellow campers hurried to the creek and lifted her to dry ground. They wrapped her leg with clean bandages from a first aid kit and kept pressure on the wound. She trembled, not from the cold, but from the shock still coursing through her. Gradually, her breathing steadied as others kept her calm and awake. Within the hour, an emergency satellite call was made, and a rescue team prepared transport from the nearest outpost. The camp stayed still until they were sure the bear would not return. The faint scent of the flare lingered in the air, mixing with the sharp smell of mud and disturbed earth. Rescuers arrived by rivercraft and secured Emma on a stretcher. She was lifted carefully and carried through the narrow path back to safer ground. Her injury was serious, but not life-threatening. She remained conscious, gripping her father's hand as they moved her toward the waiting craft. For the rest of that summer, the site remained untouched. The scattered rocks, claw marks in the mud, and broken brush stayed exactly as they were, a quiet memorial to how swiftly calm wilderness could turn violent. The Lewis family never forgot how silent the forest had been in the seconds before it erupted. It was August 14th, 2020, near a quiet Baltic fishing coast, where a small port stood between dark pine forests and the calm evening sea. The sky glowed orange as the sun lowered toward the horizon, spreading golden light across the water. Fishing boats were tied along the pier, their nets hanging to dry after a long day at sea. Marek Kozlov, a 38-year-old dock worker born and raised in the nearby village, was finishing his shift. He had worked at the port since his teens, hauling fresh catches, managing shipments, and helping fishermen unload their boats each evening. He was strong, experienced, and accustomed to the steady rhythm of marine labor. Marek had always respected the wild forests close to the shoreline. He'd grown up hearing old stories from sailors and fishermen about wolves, wild boars, and the rare sight of a wandering brown bear. The dense woodlands beyond the harbor were known for their mossy ground, hidden marshes, and winding animal trails. But sightings of large predators near the docks were almost unheard of. Most wildlife avoided the noise of boats and people. That evening, Marek stacked wooden crates filled with fish along the pier. The smell of herring and sprat hung heavily in the humid air. Around him, a few co-workers secured ropes and sorted gear for the night. The gentle splash of waves against the dock mixed with the sharp cries of gulls circling overhead. For a brief time, everything felt calm and ordinary. Then came a rustling sound from the far edge of the port, deep and heavy, unlike wind or birds. Marek turned toward the tree line, expecting maybe a stray dog or a deer. But from the shadows of the forest, a massive brown bear emerged. Its fur was dark and matted, its movement slow yet powerful. Against the fading orange sky, it looked enormous. Its head lifted as it caught the scent of fresh fish. Marek froze, heart pounding as the bear stepped onto the pier. The wooden boards creaked under its weight. In seconds, it swung a broad paw at the nearest stack of crates, shattering them apart. Fish spilled across the wet planks, sliding into the sea. Water and scales sprayed through the air as the animal sniffed and pawed at the broken containers, driven purely by hunger. Marek ducked behind a tall stack of pallets, pressing his back against the wood while the bear continued forward. Workers farther down the pier saw the danger and reacted fast. Some grabbed emergency flares, while others blasted truck horns from vehicles parked along the dock. The sharp sounds echoed across the quiet harbor. The bear lifted its head, ears twitching, and paused near the edge of the pier, mud dripping from its paws. For several long seconds, it stood still, sniffing the air, testing the wind. The scent of fish clung to every surface. Marek stayed silent behind the pallets, every moment stretching like an eternity. The sea breeze carried the sharp tang of salt and fish across the dock, keeping the animal's attention fixed on the pier. Workers on the opposite side continued waving flares and sounding horns, the flashes of orange light reflecting across the darkening water. The bear's head lifted at the glare of the lights. For a moment, it looked ready to turn away. Then it swung a massive paw again, smashing another line of crates into the water. Fish flew through the air, splashing loudly as startled seagulls dove and wheeled overhead. Marek felt the vibrations of the impact through the boards beneath him. The pier now looked as if a storm had swept through. Crates splintered, nets tangled, fish scales scattered everywhere. At last, the constant noise from flares, horns, and clanging metal began to overwhelm the animal. The bear hesitated, nostrils flaring as it tested the air again. Slowly, it turned back toward the tree line. The dark silhouette moved step by step into the pines until it vanished completely into the shadows. Silence returned to the harbor, broken only by waves lapping at the dock and the fading cries of gulls. Marek stayed still for several moments longer, listening. When he was certain the bear was gone, he stepped out from behind the pallets. His hands trembled, and sweat clung to his neck despite the cool evening air. One by one, other workers emerged from cover, scanning the forest edge to confirm the coast was clear. The pier was left in chaos. Broken wood, crushed containers, and scattered fish covered the boards. Water splashed over the edges where waves carried loose debris away. Workers began cleaning, piling splinters and gathering equipment. The deep claw marks gouged into the planks showed how close the bear had come to the heart of the harbor. By nightfall, floodlights were switched on along the pier, bathing the water in harsh white glow. Extra precautions went into effect immediately. All remaining fish were locked in sealed storage, and trucks were repositioned to form a barrier near the tree line. Local wildlife officers were notified, and word spread quickly through nearby villages that a large bear had entered the working harbor. Marek finished his shift in uneasy silence. The familiar port, a place he'd spent his entire adult life, suddenly felt different. It wasn't just a workplace anymore, but a reminder that the wilderness was never far away. Even in towns shaped by human effort, the wild could step out of the trees at any moment. The incident left the crew shaken but unharmed. A vivid memory carried through the fishing season, the night the forest reached the water's edge, and the line between human order and nature's power briefly disappeared. It was February 10th, 2025, at a remote Arctic mountain resort in Nunavut, Canada, where frozen peaks stretched across a vast white horizon and the air stung with bitter cold. The resort was built for adventure travelers who came to ski, snowmobile, and experience the raw isolation of the northern wilderness. Snow coated every rooftop and trail, and icy winds blew fine crystals across the open terrace where guests often gathered to watch the sunrise. Olivia Jensen, a 42-year-old resort manager from northern Denmark, had spent years working in harsh Arctic environments. She was known for her calm leadership and strict focus on safety, especially during winter months when wildlife moved closer in search of food. Olivia had been part of the resort team since its opening. She trained every staff member to act fast in emergencies, knowing that even the smallest mistake in the Arctic could become fatal. That morning, she had helped workers secure outdoor storage after breakfast preparations were finished. Boxes of dried meat, smoked fish, and sealed supplies were locked inside insulated crates, kept tight against the freezing temperatures. Only a faint trace of scent lingered in the air, but in the wild north, even that could be enough to attract attention. Among the guests enjoying the morning view was Sophie Alvarez, a 38-year-old adventure traveler from Chile who had come to experience the Arctic winter for the first time. She loved challenging environments and had completed mountain hikes in Patagonia and ice treks in Iceland. The cold of Nunavut was harsher than anything she had felt before, but she was excited rather than afraid, standing on the terrace wrapped in thermal gear, watching the pale sun rise above the snowfields. The terrace looked peaceful at first, with guests sipping warm drinks and snowmobiles parked neatly nearby. But from the edge of the forest, where pine trees stood coated in frost, a shadow began to move. Slowly, a massive polar bear stepped out from behind the tree line. Its white fur blended with the snow, but its heavy breathing sent clouds of mist into the icy air. The animal walked forward with slow, powerful steps, nose raised as it followed the fading scent of fish and meat from the storage area. Guests froze in place as the bear approached the open terrace. Its black eyes locked onto the movement ahead, and its huge paws sank deep into the snow with every step. Olivia noticed it immediately and rushed toward the entrance, flare gun in hand. She called out orders to retreat into the building. Staff members began guiding guests toward the doors, but in the rush, Sophie's boot slipped on the icy surface. She fell hard onto her side, her legs sliding closer to the bear's path. The polar bear's attention shifted instantly. In a sudden burst of speed, it lunged forward, closing the distance in seconds. Its massive paw struck Sophie's leg, claws tearing through snow and fabric as she was knocked onto her back, gasping as cold filled her lungs. Olivia rushed forward through the snow, raising the flare gun as the polar bear loomed over Sophie. The bear's breath came in heavy white bursts, and its claws had already torn deep lines through her insulated pants. Its fur bristled, and the sound of its growl vibrated through the frozen air. Olivia fired the flare just inches from its face. The sudden blast of light and heat streaked past the bear's eyes, crackling through the air before hissing into the snow nearby. The giant predator reared back in shock, paws scraping the ice as it swung its head away from the searing light. Its roar echoed against the mountainside, rattling windows and sending snow cascading from nearby roofs. For a tense moment, it stood tall, ears pinned flat, unsure whether to attack or escape. Flames from the flare flickered on the snow, adding noise and motion that further pushed the bear off balance. It took several long strides backward, then turned sharply and lumbered back toward the tree line, snow exploding beneath its paws with each powerful step. Sophie lay motionless for a moment before Olivia and two staff members reached her. They pulled her carefully across the snow and lifted her toward the resort entrance as other guests held the doors open. Her leg was covered in snow and blood, and bruises were already forming beneath the torn fabric. She was conscious but shaken, her breathing uneven and shallow. The cold made every second critical as frostbite could begin quickly in exposed areas. Staff guided her into the warm interior lobby, where emergency equipment had already been prepared. Outside, sleds and equipment lay scattered across the terrace. The snow was deeply marked with claw prints, long and wide enough to swallow a human foot. Several storage crates had been knocked over, and meat scents still lingered faintly in the frigid air. Staff began moving quickly to secure all remaining food and remove anything that might draw the bear back. The once calm morning had been transformed into chaos, the silence broken, and the safety of the resort shaken in an instant. Medical staff treated Sophie inside the resort, wrapping her injuries and controlling the bleeding. She had severe bruising along her leg and several deep gashes, but no bone had been broken. Warm blankets and heated air helped bring her body temperature back to safe levels. Olivia stayed close, organizing communication with wildlife authorities in the nearby town. Rangers were notified to patrol the area and track any further animal movement along the forest perimeter. By afternoon, the resort grounds showed visible signs of the morning's attack. Sleds were overturned, snow packed down with wide claw marks, and equipment scattered across the terrace. Guests remained indoors, watching through windows in silent disbelief at how quickly danger had appeared from the wilderness. Staff added reinforced barriers and posted warning signs, advising visitors to stay away from the outer edges of the grounds until further notice. The incident served as a sharp reminder that even with preparation and caution, the Arctic remained untamed. In a land where survival belonged to the strongest, one brief moment of scent was enough to summon a predator to the heart of a human refuge. Though Sophie survived, the memory of the bear's power lingered in every footprint stamped into the snow. On the morning of June 12, 2020, Kodiak Island lay swathed in a thin veil of fog that clung low over the salmon-filled river, the gray mist swirling across the water like smoke from a distant fire. And as Simon Hayes and his colleague Alex Moreno paddled their kayaks carefully through the narrow, twisting channels, their eyes scanning the banks for wildlife, the river whispered beneath their blades, icy water pressing cold and relentless against their arms, while the scent of fresh fish and riverweed mixed with the faint tang of salt carried from the bay beyond, oblivious to the predator lurking just beyond the spruce line. Simon adjusted his life vest and tightened the straps on his camera equipment, intent on documenting the movement of the salmon and the occasional flash of eagles above, unaware that the dense trees that lined the riverbank concealed something far more dangerous than the occasional bird or moose, something that had been watching them for minutes, gauging movement, scent, and opportunity. A massive male Kodiak bear, its fur dark and bristling with the morning damp, muscles coiled beneath its shaggy frame, and eyes locked with a predatory focus that zeroed in on Simon's bright kayak, as though it were a target the bear had chosen long before either man had stepped onto the water. The river narrowed suddenly, forcing the kayaks closer together and closer to the bank where the bear crouched, its massive paws sinking slightly into the soft, mossy ground, claws gleaming faintly in the diffused light. And for a heartbeat, the morning seemed suspended in uneasy silence, the kind that grips the chest and makes the skin prickle with anticipation, before the bear erupted into motion with terrifying speed, crashing through the undergrowth in a controlled surge of raw power that sent water droplets spraying into the fog as it lunged toward the riverbank, eyes fixed, teeth bared, every ounce of its enormous body committed to the charge. Simon barely had time to react, raising his paddle instinctively. As the bear's first swipe hit the kayak, slamming against the side with a sound like a tree snapping under immense pressure. Before Simon could brace himself, the craft tipped violently, throwing him into the icy water, the river immediately seizing him in its swift, merciless current. At the same time, the fog twisted and rolled over him like a living thing, threatening to pull him under with every wave and rapid that barreled him forward. Alex screamed, the sound swallowed instantly by the roar of water and the bear's growls as he struggled to maneuver his own kayak closer to the bank, paddles slashing through the water in desperate arcs. But the bear moved with terrifying purpose, grabbing Simon's pack with one powerful paw and dragging it into the spruce, tearing it from the overturned kayak, and Simon, clinging to the currents and tangled in ropes, cameras, and fishing gear, was immediately caught in the struggle between survival and the river's relentless pull, the icy water pressing into his lungs and numbing his limbs while boulders and submerged logs struck him with sudden, crushing force as he was swept downstream. The roar of the bear followed him briefly, a visceral reminder of the predator's presence and lethal power, before fading slightly as the animal retreated into the trees with its prize, leaving Simon to the merciless river, its currents hurling him under rocks, over rapids, and around jagged bends, each collision twisting his body and gear in ways that moved nearly impossible. At the same time, adrenaline burned a frantic path through his veins, forcing him to cling, to fight, to survive, even as the water dragged him farther from any hope of safety. Alex finally managed to bring his kayak to the shore, collapsing on the mud and gravel, drenched to the bone, trembling violently as he scrambled to peer downstream, catching only brief glimpses of Simon's flailing limbs before the man disappeared entirely beneath the frothing water, swallowed by the river's violent embrace, leaving Alex with nothing but the echoing roars of the bear and the stark, terrifying silence that followed its departure. The river now dotted with pieces of broken kayaks, scattered gear, and deep claw marks along the mossy banks where the animal had tested its strength against man and machine alike. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the chaos, aware that every second he spent on shore was a second too long, that Simon's life depended on the whims of water and gravity, both as indiscriminate and merciless as the predator they had just encountered. Hours passed like slow, grinding agony as Alex clung to the riverbank, shivering violently in his soaked clothes, scanning every bend, every whitecap, every shadow along the fog-drenched water for some sign of his friend. The fog thickening and thinning unpredictably, the sun rising behind layers of clouds and doing nothing to warm the chill that settled in his bones. And when rescuers finally arrived, their faces pale and eyes wide with the realization of what had occurred, they worked with careful precision, pulling broken kayaks and equipment from the water, searching through rapids and eddies with ropes and lines, before they found Simon's body downstream, battered, cold, and lifeless, a stark and haunting testament to the brutal combination of predator and river that had claimed him with inexorable force. The riverbank where the attack had occurred bore evidence of the encounter in every claw mark etched deep into the spruce and along moss-covered rocks, and in Alex's memory, forever marked by the sudden violent intrusion of the Kodiak bear into what had begun as an ordinary morning, reminding him that in the remote wilds of Kodiak Island, power and speed could converge in a single terrifying instant, leaving only wreckage, grief, and the lasting impression of one of North America's most formidable predators, acting with instinct, precision, and lethal inevitability. On October 12, 2018, the small village of Esso in Russia's Far East, bustling under the muted light of a gray autumn morning. The schoolyard stirred with the rhythm of daily routines as children hurried between classes, their laughter carrying brightly across the crisp air, mingling with the scent of pine, earth, and freshly packed lunches scattered on tables and benches. Beyond the fenced yard, the taiga rose sharply, dense with birch, spruce, and fir, its floor littered with fallen leaves and rotting fruit that had been tossed from the school windows or forgotten in lunch containers, carrying an aroma that drifted enticingly into the forest and reached the sensitive nose of a massive Russian grizzly, wandering in search of food after its habitat had been disrupted by logging operations farther up the slope. The bear, emaciated and tense from weeks of hunger, had moved cautiously through the trees, sniffing, testing the undergrowth with its enormous paws, each step leaving deep impressions in the soft soil, until it emerged from a thicket beside a small creek that cut behind the school buildings, suddenly visible and impossibly close, its black eyes gleaming with raw intensity as it assessed the open yard before it. The first reaction was chaos. The bear charged, crashing through the edge of the forest with terrifying speed, its bulk shaking the ground beneath the fallen leaves, scattering swings, benches, and bicycles as if they were toys. Children screamed and ran, feet pounding the concrete as teachers scrambled to close doors and usher students inside. But 10-year-old Pavel Orlov, carrying a backpack and distracted by a ball rolling near a storage shed, tripped and fell, arms outstretched, unable to regain his balance before the massive predator struck. The bear's first contact was brutal, a swift blow that sent Pavel sprawling to the ground, his small frame no match for the animal's raw power. The sound of the impact echoed through the yard, silencing the fleeing children for a brief, heart-stopping moment. Nearby, teacher Irina Sokolov, already in motion to secure the remaining students, spotted the bear and the boy. Acting on instinct, she grabbed a long metal rod from the storage area and waved it, shouting as loudly as she could. Each motion was intended to confuse and distract the bear, pulling its attention away from the prone child. The bear hesitated, sniffing the air and grunting low, then pawed at the ground in the shed, temporarily retreating a few steps back toward the forest edge, growling in frustration at the sudden obstacle. Irina pressed herself forward, continuing to make noise, her heart pounding and sweat running down her back despite the cool autumn air, knowing that every second counted and that the creature could turn its full force on them at any instant. Villagers, alerted by the screams and the sound of crashing metal and snapping wood, began arriving from nearby homes, some grabbing tools. In contrast, others climbed onto raised platforms or fences to gain safety while keeping a watchful eye on the bear. By the time they reached the schoolyard, the bear had begun to move back toward the creek, distracted by the human presence, and perhaps calculating the cost of staying versus retreating. But it was too late for Pavel. His small body had already suffered the force of blunt trauma, evident to rescuers even before they reached him. The ground around him marked with shallow grooves where the bear had pawed at the area, and the boy's belongings, backpack, lunchbox, a small sweater, lay scattered and torn across the yard. The aftermath left the schoolyard in ruins. Benches were overturned, swings twisted and broken, bicycles scattered and scratched with deep claw marks, and the earth bore paw prints several inches deep, pressed into the soft soil by the immense weight of the bear. Teachers and villagers moved cautiously among the debris, securing the remaining children and surveying the damage. At the same time, emergency responders from the district arrived, bringing ropes, vehicles, and radios to communicate with authorities in the region. Each person who had witnessed the attack carried the vivid memory of the bear's sudden appearance and the terrifying speed with which it had struck, the intensity of the sound, and the sheer size of the animal that could appear from the forest as if conjured by the autumn fog. Even after the bear retreated into the dense forest, leaving only the overturned items and paw prints behind, the lesson remained clear and chilling. Human settlements that border wild habitats are inherently vulnerable, especially when apex predators are displaced from their traditional ranges by logging or other human activity. Pavel's death was sudden, unavoidable in the context of the bear's size, hunger, and force, and his classmates and teachers were left to process a trauma that had arrived in seconds, reminding everyone that the boundaries between human territory and wildlife territory could collapse in moments, with consequences that were permanent and devastating. As villagers worked to repair fences and reassure frightened children, the forest beyond the creek remained quiet, hiding the massive form of the bear that had caused such destruction, waiting and watching from the shadows, a reminder that nature could not be fully controlled, and that encounters between humans and wildlife, particularly displaced or starving predators, could erupt without warning into chaos and tragedy. Irina Sokolov later recounted the events with vivid clarity. The bear had moved too fast for anyone to intervene effectively, its focus entirely on the opportunity before it, and even experienced adults were powerless to prevent what had happened. The yard, once a place of laughter and play, was now a stark lesson in the consequences of human-wildlife interaction. The debris, claw marks, and personal items of the victims were a haunting record of an encounter that had lasted less than a minute, but would be remembered for a lifetime. In the end, the small village returned to routine as best it could, children resuming lessons under careful supervision, fences reinforced, and the community discussing ways to reduce attractants that might draw bears closer in the future. Yet the memory of that morning, the suddenness of the bear's charge, and the tragic loss of young Pavel remained, a lasting reminder of how quickly the line between safety and danger can vanish when apex predators roam near human spaces, and how vulnerable even familiar everyday places become when the wild asserts itself in force. On August 21, 2023, The dense forests of northern Romania were alive with the quiet hum of late summer, sunlight filtering through layers of oak, beech, and fir, while the undergrowth rustled faintly with the movement of deer, birds, and the occasional fox. Eric Novak, a wildlife enthusiast and experienced caretaker, moved along a narrow trail toward a semi-wild enclosure several miles from his sanctuary, checking on a brown bear that he had raised from a cub. The bear, once small enough to fit in his arms, now weighed more than 600 pounds of solid muscle, its size and strength a constant reminder that even familiarity could not diminish the instincts honed over decades in the wild. Eric carried a backpack containing monitoring equipment, a first aid kit, and a flare gun. Although he approached the enclosure with confidence, born of years of handling the animal, he remained vigilant, aware that the unpredictability of apex predators demanded respect. The bear's enclosure, a broad, fenced area nestled within a hollow of mixed forest and open meadow, had been designed to allow it a semi-wild existence, giving it room to roam while still being monitored after relocation. Eric had visited the site twice a week since the bear's transfer, observing its adaptation, noting behavior patterns, and occasionally providing supplemental food. Today he was confident that the animal recognized him, that the bond formed during its formative years would prevent aggression. As he neared the enclosure, he spotted the bear moving through a patch of ferns and low shrubs, large paws pressing deep into the soft earth, its dark eyes following him without apparent hostility, the powerful frame moving with deliberate grace across uneven terrain. Without warning, a rustling in the underbrush to Eric's right startled the bear. A small animal, perhaps a deer fawn or a stray dog, darted past, and in an instant the bear's instincts overrode the familiarity it had with Eric. It lunged with terrifying speed, paws pounding against the forest floor, muscles coiled and released in a burst of force that sent leaves and branches scattering. Eric froze, shock registering before instinct could respond, then tried to step back calmly, speaking in low tones he hoped would remind the bear of their bond. But the animal's response was not reasoned or sentimental, it was purely instinctual, and within seconds it swiped violently, striking Eric against a fallen tree with the force of its massive shoulder, knocking the breath from his lungs and leaving him scrambling to regain balance. Pinned under the bear's weight and partially shielded by the fallen log, Eric struggled, adrenaline surging through him as he attempted to protect his head and torso. Still, the bear's claws tore through clothing and flesh with brutal precision, slashing arms and legs, raking across his back and driving him to the forest floor. Pain exploded in waves, each movement sending shock through his body, while the bear circled briefly, growling low and deep, its instincts attuned to any movement that might signify vulnerability. Eric clawed at the ground, trying to push himself away, breathe, and find leverage, but the size and power of the animal were overwhelming. Hearing the commotion, nearby colleagues who had been observing from a safe distance reacted immediately, firing flares into the air and shouting in an attempt to distract the bear and create noise and flashes that might redirect its attention away from Eric. The bear hesitated, snapping its head toward the flares and growling in confusion, but only temporarily. Each step and paw movement still radiated raw power and intent. Minutes dragged on like hours as Eric remained trapped beneath the assault, every second filled with the desperate struggle to survive, muscles screaming, skin raw, and mind racing through memories of training, past encounters, and the realization that the bear he had nurtured as a cub now existed on its own terms, guided entirely by instinct. Finally, the bear retreated, moving back into the shadows of the forest with powerful strides, leaving behind only the scent of its presence and the devastation wrought in moments of ungoverned strength. Eric lay on the forest floor, bleeding heavily, bruised and broken, the echo of the bear's growls fading but leaving a permanent mark on his body and mind. Colleagues rushed to his side, applying pressure to wounds, checking for breathing, and signaling emergency responders, but it was immediately clear that the severity of his injuries was overwhelming. Despite rapid intervention, Eric succumbed to blunt force trauma and massive lacerations, a stark reminder that even a lifelong familiarity with an apex predator could not mitigate the animal's instinctual response when startled or provoked. The forest around the enclosure returned to its quiet state, leaves whispering in the wind and sunlight falling through the trees, masking the horror that had just occurred. The bear, now fully wild once again, disappeared into the dense thickets, leaving behind the evidence of its power, deep claw marks on the ground and logs, trampled undergrowth, and the stark absence of the man who had once nurtured it. The tragedy resonated deeply with the colleagues who had witnessed the attack, and with the wildlife community, serving as a grim illustration of how unpredictable and dangerous apex predators can remain, even when a bond of years exists between humans and animals. Eric Novak's death underscored the stark truth that no familiarity can erase the fundamental instincts of creatures shaped by the wild. A bear may recognize a face or a scent. Still, when survival instincts are triggered by a sudden movement, an unfamiliar noise, or a perceived threat, their reaction is neither sentimental nor negotiable. The forest, beautiful and tranquil, had been the stage for a violent assertion of power and instinct, and the memory of the attack lingered in the minds of those present, haunting and sobering, a reminder that respect for wildlife must always accompany observation, care, and admiration. Even after the bear had vanished from sight, colleagues remained cautious, securing the area and reviewing protocols to prevent similar tragedies. The forest itself offered no apologies, no indications that the violence had occurred beyond the trampled ferns and broken branches. Yet the lessons were stark. Instinctual behavior in apex predators is absolute. Bonds of familiarity cannot override raw strength and survival mechanisms, and humans, no matter their experience or intent, remain vulnerable when encountering animals whose nature is both majestic and lethal. The semi-wild enclosure would continue to serve its purpose. Still, Eric's death became a permanent reminder of the limits of control and understanding, and the delicate line between care and danger in the presence of creatures whose power dwarfs human certainty. March 12, 2024, the frozen coast of northern Alaska lay under a dim, colorless sky, where the horizon blurred into endless white and the air shimmered with cold so sharp it seemed alive. A small helicopter cut across that frozen silence, its blades sending fine snow whirling into the wind. Inside were three people. Pilot David Harmon, 38, a seasoned veteran of remote flying, biologist Clara Jensen, 35, who had spent her career studying Arctic wildlife, and field technician Aaron Briggs, 29, who handled the recording gear and tagging equipment stacked neatly behind their seats. They were part of a government survey team, documenting seal populations across the drifting ice floes that stretched like fractured glass across the Beaufort Sea. After 2 hours of low flight, they spotted a cluster of seals sprawled along the edge of a wide floe, their gray bodies scattered over the pale ice like shadows. Harmon guided the helicopter down slowly, the skids settling with a soft creak on the crusted surface. The wind had calmed, leaving only the faint crack of distant shifting ice and the hum of the engine as it cooled. The team stepped out into air that burned their lungs with each breath, their boots sinking slightly into the snow as they unpacked their gear. Clara moved carefully, noting the SEAL group's behavior, while Aaron assembled the long-lens camera and recording instruments. Harmon stayed close to the helicopter, scanning the horizon as a pilot's habit, his eyes trained to notice movement even in the white monotony. The fog thickened soon after landing, rolling in from the north like a slow, living tide. Clara glanced back toward the helicopter several times, sensing the vast emptiness closing around them. To the untrained eye, the landscape appeared lifeless, but beneath the silence there was movement, faint, steady, deliberate. From the blur of fog beyond the ice ridge, a shape began to emerge, distant at first, its motion slow but unyielding. Harmon saw it before the others did, a pale outline moving against the equally pale background, so perfectly camouflaged that it seemed to materialize from the mist itself. At first he thought it might be another ridge of snow catching the wind, until it lifted its head and he saw the unmistakable shape of a polar bear. The bear was enormous, its fur yellowed by age and hunger, its shoulders heavy, but its body thinner than it should have been for early spring. It moved with an uneven gait, head swinging low, sniffing the air as it approached. Polar bears, Clara knew, were driven by smell more than sight, and the helicopter's fuel scent, the sweat of humans, and the faint trace of seal flesh in the air were enough to draw it across the frozen expanse. Harmon signaled for everyone to get back inside, his voice steady but urgent, the wind rising again as if warning them of what was coming. The bear picked up speed, closing the distance quickly across the open ice, its long claws scraping the surface with each stride. Clara climbed into the back seat, pulling the door halfway shut as Harmon started the engine, his fingers trembling against the ignition. The rotors began to spin, scattering loose snow, but before the lift could build, the bear was already there, slamming into the side of the helicopter with a force that shook the entire frame. The metal groaned, and one of the skids shifted, scraping deep into the ice. The bear's paws came down hard again, claws carving into aluminum, its breath blasting through the open door where Harmon's leg had not yet pulled back. One swipe connected, tearing through his flight suit and deep into his thigh, a flash of red against white. He shouted in pain, instinctively hitting the throttle, trying to lift off even as the machine rocked dangerously. Clara grabbed the canister of bear deterrent from under the seat, yanking the safety tab free and spraying through the open gap. The orange mist burst into the air, carried by the rotor wash directly toward the bear's face. The animal reared back, roaring in fury, striking again at the skids and tearing loose a small panel that clattered across the ice. Snow and fuel residue mixed in the air, stinging their eyes, and the helicopter pitched slightly as Harmon fought for control. Aaron reached for the emergency flares, lighting one and throwing it out toward the bear's feet. The flare hissed, red and violent against the white, rolling and sputtering near the creature's chest. For several seconds the bear hesitated, swinging its head back and forth, its black eyes wide and uncertain, its breath visible in heavy clouds. Then it lunged again, ramming its shoulder into the front of the helicopter, nearly toppling it. The sound was deafening. Rotors cutting through air, the engine straining, the flare crackling, all merging into one chaotic roar. Harmon gritted his teeth through the pain, forcing the throttle higher, the helicopter straining to rise as the bear continued to strike. Finally, as the combined noise and light reached a fever pitch, the bear stumbled back, disoriented and blinded by the deterrent. It turned away, lumbering slowly toward the fog, stopping once to look back before vanishing into the white haze that had swallowed the horizon. Harmon managed to keep the machine hovering low enough to stay stable until Clara reached forward and secured his bleeding leg with a strap torn from a backpack. The floor was smeared with snow and blood, and Aaron was still clutching the flare pistol, his hands shaking. The helicopter rose unsteadily, its side dented and the left panel flapping loose, but the engine held. They flew southeast toward the nearest coastal outpost, the flight taking 20 agonizing minutes through blinding fog and turbulence. Harmon's face was pale, jaw clenched against the pain, while Clara pressed his leg to slow the bleeding, her other hand gripping the seat frame to steady herself. When they finally landed, medical crews rushed to pull them out, their boots crunching over the icy pad as the rotors slowed. Harmon's leg was broken and deeply lacerated, the wound just missing a major artery. Clara's arm was bruised and scratched, and Aaron's shoulder ached from where he had been thrown against the doorframe. Later, wildlife experts confirmed that the bear was likely in severe starvation after a season of poor ice coverage, its desperate behavior a reflection of how rapidly the Arctic's balance was collapsing. They warned that such encounters would become more common as the sea ice thinned earlier each year, forcing predators and people ever closer together in the fading cold. On August 21, 2021, the forests of northern Maine lay heavy with late summer mist, the air damp and cool above a winding river that moved quietly between thick walls of spruce and cedar. Wildlife photographer Sophie Lang, 33 years old, guided her small green canoe through the still water, her camera resting between her knees, its lens fogged slightly by the morning chill. She had come alone, as she often did, drawn to the solitude and the soft light that fell over the valley in late August, when salmon began their upriver migration. The silence was broken only by the rhythm of her paddle, dipping and rising, with droplets breaking the surface in slow, deliberate motion. Sophie had been working for 2 days, camping along the bends and photographing the salmon as they moved through the shallows, their bodies flickering silver beneath the surface. That morning she reached a stretch of river that widened briefly before narrowing again, the kind of place where the current split around smooth stones and created shallow riffles perfect for photographs. She eased the canoe toward the bank, the bow scraping lightly against gravel, and stepped out carefully, camera in hand, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. The light had turned soft and golden through the mist, and she crouched low, focusing on the shimmering movement beneath the water. The forest behind her was still, dense with ferns and low berry brush that grew thick near the edge of the river. She noticed the faint sound of something shifting, branches cracking, foliage rustling in slow, uneven rhythm, but thought little of it, assuming it was wind or perhaps a deer moving through the trees. Her camera shutter clicked several times, echoing faintly off the water, before the sound from behind grew sharper, heavier, closer. When she turned, she saw it, A black bear, large and dark, emerging from the brush less than 10 meters away, its fur matted from moisture, its head swinging low as it tested the air. For one suspended second, neither moved. The mist wavered between them, blurring the distance, and the bear seemed as startled as she was. Then it lowered its head and charged. The rush of movement came faster than she could think, the sound of claws tearing through mud, of water splashing as it crossed the narrow riverbank. Sophie stumbled backward toward the canoe, heart hammering, camera still hanging from her neck as she reached for the gunwale. The bear's weight struck the front of the canoe, its paw smashing against the bow with a heavy crack that split the wood and sent water splashing over her legs. The canoe tilted dangerously, and her camera dropped into the shallow water beside her, sinking beneath silt and foam. She reached for the paddle instinctively, gripping it like a barrier, swinging it in wide arcs as the bear lunged again. The paddle struck its shoulder with a hollow thud, slowing it only for a moment before another swipe sent splinters flying. Sophie fell backward, half inside the canoe, the edge of the hull biting into her thigh as she tried to keep her balance. The bear roared, its breath visible in the damp air, the sound deep and vibrating through her chest. She fumbled for the canister of bear spray clipped to her pack, tearing it free with trembling hands. As the bear lunged once more, she raised the spray and pressed the trigger. The orange mist erupted directly into its face, swirling through the fog, coating its muzzle and eyes. The bear reared up, shaking its head violently, pawing at the air as it coughed and snorted. Sophie sprayed again, sweeping the cloud wider, backing away through the shallows, her boots slipping on smooth stones as water rose around her ankles. The bear stumbled to the side, blinded and disoriented, its growls turning to frustrated grunts as it retreated several steps into the brush. For a moment it lingered, pacing in confusion, then finally turned and crashed through the trees, vanishing into the mist that hung over the forest floor. Sophie stood motionless for nearly a minute, listening to the sounds fade until all that remained was the drip of water from the canoe's cracked hull and the faint hum of insects returning. Her arms and shoulders burned where the claws had grazed her, leaving deep cuts through her jacket. Blood ran in thin lines down her sleeves, and her hands shook uncontrollably as the adrenaline began to ebb. She forced herself to breathe steadily, checking her limbs to confirm she could still move. The canoe listed slightly but remained afloat, and she climbed inside, pushing off the bank with the broken paddle until the current carried her downstream. The journey back to her camp took hours, each bend of the river stretching endlessly as her strength waned. The fog thickened again in patches, swallowing the forest edges, and every crack of a branch from the shoreline sent a jolt of fear through her chest. When she finally reached the gravel bar where she had pitched her tent, she pulled the canoe onto the shore and collapsed beside it, too weak to move for several minutes. She cleaned her wounds with river water and the small first aid kit she always carried, wrapping her arms tightly before building a fire to signal for help. Wildlife officers reached her the following morning after receiving a satellite alert from her emergency beacon. They found the canoe damaged, its bow torn open and streaked with mud. Her camera was lost to the river, and claw marks were embedded deep into the wood. After treating her injuries, they examined the area where the attack had occurred and found tracks and broken reeds leading into the dense brush. They concluded that the bear had likely been feeding nearby, drawn to the salmon-rich shallows, and that Sophie had startled it at close range in low visibility. Experts later noted that while black bears rarely act aggressively, even experienced outdoors people can misjudge the risks when silence, fog, and instinct collide. For Sophie Lang, the experience became a harsh reminder of how thin the line can be between beauty and danger in wild places, where the pursuit of a perfect image can so easily cross into survival. On July 19, 2025, the night had been unusually still in the Carpathian Mountains, the kind of silence that seems to swallow even the wind. Marek Novak, a 34-year-old camper from the Czech Republic, had chosen a remote clearing several kilometers from any marked trail. He'd hiked most of the day beneath the dark fir canopy, following the echo of a stream and the calls of distant owls until he found a patch of level ground beneath a ridge. The air smelled of pine and damp soil, and when the sun fell, he sat by his small stove, eating soup from a tin while fog rose from the forest floor. He had camped alone before, confident in his knowledge and gear, but that confidence would soon dissolve into fear he'd never known. Sometime after midnight, he awoke to the sound of branches cracking in the distance. At first, he thought it was the wind or perhaps a deer passing near the stream. But then came a sound lower and heavier, a grunt deep and guttural vibrating through the ground. His pulse quickened as he unzipped his sleeping bag and reached for his headlamp. The beam of light illuminated the inner walls of the tent, trembling as his hand shook. Outside, something large was moving in slow, deliberate circles around the campsite. The scent hit him next, a sharp musk mixed with the odor of earth and rot. He knew it instantly, a brown bear. He froze, listening to its breathing grow louder, its steps pressing into the soft earth. The animal brushed against his tent, the nylon rippling with each movement. Then, without warning, a massive paw pressed down against the side, flattening the fabric inches from his face. Marek stifled a gasp. The bear sniffed, huffed, and clawed lightly, testing the strange structure before pulling back. For several moments, there was only silence, and he thought it might leave. Then came the sound of tearing fabric. The tent shuddered as the bear raked its claws across it. Marek scrambled backward, grabbing his bear spray and flashlight. He shouted, his voice cracking in the darkness. But the animal responded with a deep snarl and charged, striking the side of the tent with such force that it collapsed halfway. He could hear its breath, loud and wet, as it pawed at his pack near the entrance. The smell of food, small crumbs, maybe a bit of soup spilled earlier, had betrayed him. He cursed himself for not hanging it away from camp. He tried to shine the headlamp directly toward the noise, but the bear lunged again, slamming into the tent. The beam flickered as the lamp flew from his hand. Marek dove beneath his sleeping bag, curling tight as the animal's claws tore through the upper layers of fabric. Pain shot through his forearm as one claw caught him, opening a long, burning gash. He could hear the fabric ripping and the poles snapping, the tent no longer a barrier but a shredded shell. Minutes blurred into an eternity of noise, snorts, growls, the rustling of the bear circling, pressing, retreating, then returning. Each time Marek moved or breathed too loudly, the creature reacted, stomping or clawing again. He could feel the cold night air pouring through the holes and the smell of fear thick in his throat. He reached for the bear spray again, gripping it with blood-slick fingers. When the bear's snout pressed against the opening near his boots, he squeezed the trigger. The hiss of the spray filled the air, followed by a loud, furious roar. The bear stumbled back, coughing and shaking its head. Marek could hear it thrashing in the brush beyond the tent. For a few seconds, silence returned. He barely breathed, hoping the attack was over. But the bear came back. It circled again, pacing heavily, grumbling, and occasionally slapping the tent as if testing whether the strange creature inside was still alive. Each pass felt like an hour. Marek remained curled up, whispering to himself to stay calm. The bear's persistence seemed endless. It was not the quick charge of defense, but the hungry, deliberate curiosity of a predator that had learned humans sometimes carried food. Hours passed. The forest began to pale with the first hint of dawn, a faint gray light filtering through the torn tent walls. Marek's arms and shoulders throbbed, his skin sticky with blood and dirt. He no longer dared to move. The bear's movements slowed as the sky brightened, its growls softer, less certain. Finally, with a long grunt and a crashing of undergrowth, it turned and lumbered back toward the trees. The forest swallowed the sound of its departure. Marek stayed still for nearly half an hour, afraid it might return. When he finally crawled out, the morning was cold and damp, the ground around his camp shredded and scattered. His tent looked like it had exploded. Deep paw prints pressed into the mud, some only a meter from where he'd lain. His backpack was torn open, its contents scattered across the grass, including food and clothes. He packed what little he could salvage and followed the river downstream, every noise in the forest making him flinch. He reached a ranger station by afternoon, dehydrated and shivering, his forearm bandaged with strips from his shirt. Rangers helped treat his wounds and later returned to the site to collect his gear. They found clear signs of a large brown bear, fresh scat, claw marks on a nearby tree, and tufts of fur caught in the tent fabric. Experts explained that the bear had likely been drawn by the scent of food and had spent hours testing the tent, uncertain but unwilling to leave a potential meal behind. Marek later said the longest night of his life had taught him a lesson that every camper in bear country should know. Curiosity and hunger can make even cautious animals relentless. He survived, but his encounter served as a grim example of how close the line can be between solitude and survival, when humans forget that the forest is never truly theirs. The Carpathian Mountains of Romania had long been a destination for adventure tourism, drawing thrill seekers from across Europe to experience its dramatic gorges, dense forests, and opportunities for extreme sports. On May 14, 2025, the region was experiencing perfect spring weather, with morning mist clinging to the valleys and temperatures that promised a warm afternoon. The area had become increasingly popular for bungee jumping, with several companies setting up operations along the deeper gorges, where the combination of height and natural beauty created an unforgettable experience. Adrian Stoica, a 31-year-old software engineer from Bucharest, had been looking forward to this trip for months. He had convinced his friend Ioana Marin, 28 and considerably more cautious by nature, to join him for what he promised would be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. They had signed up with a reputable adventure tour company that employed 2 experienced guides who had been operating in the Carpathians for over 5 years. The jump site was located in a narrow gorge surrounded by thick forest, with the platform constructed 60 meters above the forest floor. The company had completed all necessary safety inspections, and the guides had briefed Adrian and Ioana thoroughly on the procedures. Adrian went first, his whoops of excitement echoing off the rock walls as he plummeted downward before the bungee cord caught and bounced him back up. Ioana followed minutes later, her scream transforming from terror to exhilaration as the cord did its job perfectly. Both landed safely on the padded forest floor, adrenaline still coursing through their systems as they unclipped from their harnesses. The guides began the methodical process of gathering the ropes and checking the equipment for the next group scheduled to arrive in an hour. The area where they worked was relatively clear, with the underbrush cut back to prevent any entanglement issues with the bungee cords. What none of them had considered was that the Carpathian brown bear population had been expanding in recent years, with conservation efforts proving successful, perhaps too successful for the comfort of those who worked in the remote areas. One particular male, weighing approximately 250 kilograms, had been foraging in the area throughout the morning. The bear had caught the scent of food from the backpacks the group had left near the base of the gorge, packs that contained energy bars, sandwiches, and other items that smelled intensely appealing to an animal preparing for the active summer months. The bear emerged from a section of undergrowth roughly 20 meters from where they were working. For a moment, nobody noticed its presence. The animal moved with surprising quiet for its size, drawn directly toward the pile of backpacks. One of the guides spotted it first and shouted a warning, but the bear had already reached the equipment. It swatted at a fallen rope with one massive paw, the movement almost playful, but demonstrating the raw power in the animal's limbs. Then it turned its attention to the backpacks, and that was when Adrian made a critical mistake. Instead of backing away slowly as the guides were urgently instructing, he moved forward, apparently trying to retrieve his bag, which contained his phone and wallet. The bear's response was immediate and violent. It lunged toward Adrian with shocking speed, covering the distance between them in seconds. Its paw struck his shoulder with enough force to knock him completely off his feet. He fell hard, his body scraping against rocks and exposed tree roots as he tumbled backward. His arm took the worst of the initial impact, followed by his side as he tried to roll away from the animal. Ioana screamed and began backing toward a cluster of trees, her mind struggling to process what was happening. The 2 guides reacted with the training they had gained from working in bear country. They grabbed metal equipment rods and began banging them together, creating a loud clanging noise that echoed through the gorge. They shouted continuously, trying to make themselves appear as large and threatening as possible. One guide threw his backpack directly at the bear, the bag hitting its flank and causing it to turn away from Adrian for a moment. The other guide moved laterally, still banging the metal rods and yelling. The combination of noise and perceived threats from multiple directions confused the animal. It took several steps back, swinging its head from side to side as it assessed the situation. Adrian lay on the ground, bleeding from multiple lacerations on his arm and side. He had the presence of mind to remain still, his body screaming in pain, but his survival instinct was overriding any urge to move. Ioana watched in horror from her position near the trees, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed her friend's injuries. The bear circled once more, sniffing the air and occasionally glancing at the backpacks. The guides continued their noise-making, never stopping their shouts and the metallic clanging. After what felt like an eternity but was likely less than 3 minutes, the bear seemed to lose interest. It turned and lumbered back into the undergrowth, disappearing into the forest with the same eerie quiet with which it had arrived. The moment the bear was out of sight, everyone sprang into action. The guides rushed to Adrian's side while Ioana stumbled over on shaking legs. Adrian was conscious and responsive, though clearly in severe pain. His shoulder was bruised and swelling rapidly, and the cuts on his arm were bleeding steadily. They used clothing from the backpacks to create makeshift bandages, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. One guide immediately used a satellite phone to call for emergency services, while the other performed a more thorough assessment of Adrian's injuries. They decided to move him uphill toward a clearing where a helicopter could potentially land, supporting him between them as Ioana carried the essential equipment. The medical team arrived approximately 90 minutes later, accessing the site via a rough trail that wound up from the valley floor. Adrian was treated on site before being transported to a hospital in the nearest city. His injuries, while serious, were not life-threatening. He required stitches for the lacerations and treatment for the deep bruising, but he would recover fully given time. The incident led to immediate changes in the tour company's procedures, including more extensive bear awareness training and the installation of bear-resistant containers for storing food and personal items. For Adrian and Ioana, the experience became a story they would tell with nervous laughter, though both admitted they checked their surroundings far more carefully when hiking after that day. It was October 9th, 2025, deep in a remote Alaskan mountain range, where long stretches of wilderness spread far beyond any road or town. Thick pine forests and snow-covered ridges surrounded a small cabin built miles from the nearest settlement. Tom Ridley, a 49-year-old hunter from Fairbanks, had spent most of his life in the backcountry. He was known for enduring long winters alone, tracking elk and moose through some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. Experienced and well-prepared, he carried enough supplies to remain off-grid for weeks at a time. Years earlier, he had rebuilt the old wooden cabin himself, reinforcing it against storms and heavy snow. Tom preferred the quiet of the wild to any trace of city noise. He worked as a seasonal guide during the summer and spent the colder months hunting for meat and maintaining the land he lived on. The Alaskan backcountry demanded respect. It was home to wolves, moose, and powerful grizzly bears that roamed freely in search of food. As winter approached, resources grew scarce and animals became unpredictable. Tom understood the risks, but trusted his instincts and preparation. That night was unusually still. The air outside the cabin was frozen and silent, the kind of cold that sharpened every sound. The sky hung black, with no moonlight breaking through the heavy clouds. Inside, the small wood stove kept the cabin warm as Tom rested on his cot. Tools, stored supplies, and a hunting rifle were arranged within easy reach. Beyond the walls, only the faint rustle of wind moved through the trees. At 3:18 in the morning, the stillness broke apart. A heavy crash struck the cabin exterior, loud enough to shake the wooden structure. The sudden force rattled shelves and loose items inside. Tom froze for a heartbeat as the door groaned under impact. Hinges strained, wood cracking under pressure. Something pushed against the frame with violent strength. Before he could fully stand, the door buckled inward, splintering into pieces. A massive grizzly bear, gaunt from hunger and driven by desperation, surged into the cabin. Its fur was matted, its breath clouding the air with heavy steam. It crashed through the entryway, smashing into the stove and scattering metal cookware. Jars shattered against the floor, and split firewood scattered across the room. Tom grabbed his rifle, heart hammering in his chest. He fired once. The blast echoed through the cabin, the heavy bullet tearing into the bear's shoulder. The animal reared back but did not stop. In an instant it lunged forward, its front paw striking Tom with crushing force. Claws tore deep across his thigh, sending him crashing over a fallen chair near the stove. Embers burst across the floor, filling the air with smoke as flames licked at the overturned wood. The attack had only just begun. Tom fought to push himself upright as heat and smoke spread across the floor from the tipped stove. The wood crackled loudly, flames flaring near spilled kindling. The grizzly's shadow loomed through the smoke, its massive body heaving with rage and hunger. Blood streamed down Tom's leg, soaking his pant leg as he scrambled to steady the rifle again. The bear turned, knocking over a shelf of tools and sending metal parts skidding across the ground. He fired again, the recoil jolting his injured leg. This time the shot struck deeper, lodging in bone. The grizzly roared and slammed its body sideways, crashing into the window frame. Wood shattered as glass burst outward into the frozen night. The cabin shook as the animal forced its way through the window, its bulk tearing through the broken frame. In a flurry of claws, splinters, and glass, the beast vanished into the black forest beyond the ridge. For several seconds, nothing moved. Tom remained on the floor, breath shallow, the smell of smoke and blood heavy in the air. His thigh throbbed in sharp waves of pain. The cabin lay in ruin. The stove was overturned, its iron frame glowing hot and spilling sparks. A table lay upside down against the far wall, and sacks of dry food were ripped open and scattered. The radio that had rested on a shelf was crushed beneath broken wood. His hands trembled as he dragged himself away from the spreading embers. With great effort, he tipped the stove upright, using his good leg and shoulder. Loose firewood smoldered in dark patches across the floorboards. He stamped out the sparks before they reached the walls, fighting dizziness with every movement. The cold from the open doorway and shattered window poured in, mixing with the heat and smoke. Once the flames were contained, Tom pressed strips of fabric around his wounded leg to slow the bleeding. Outside, the forest was silent, but the night felt alive, tense and waiting. He knew the bear could return at any moment, driven by pain or rage. The broken window gaped open into darkness like an unhealed wound in the cabin itself. Hours passed in painful stillness. When first light reached the trees, the cabin looked like a battlefield. Claw marks streaked the wooden walls. The stove's metal was dented. Supplies were ruined and scattered. Tom's breathing had steadied, but his body was weak from blood loss and exhaustion. He remained conscious through sheer willpower, forcing himself to stay alert until help arrived. It took rescue crews nearly 5 hours to reach the remote homestead after missing a morning check-in. They found Tom inside, barely conscious but alive amid the wreckage. He was rushed for medical care, his injuries severe but survivable. The cabin was declared unsafe and temporarily sealed. For even the most seasoned woodsman, that night proved one truth with absolute clarity. In the Alaskan frontier, no shelter was truly secure. In the silence between snow and shadow, survival depended not on comfort, but on readiness for sudden violence in the dark. It was October 19th, 2023, in a remote forest region of far eastern Russia, where endless birch woods and frozen river valleys stretched into silence. Snow drifted steadily from a gray evening sky, the wind sharp and dry as temperatures fell below freezing. A 3-man patrol from the regional wildlife unit moved carefully along an unmarked back road in a rugged off-road truck, tracking suspected poachers last sighted near a river crossing. The road was slick, their tires grinding through ice as they pressed deeper into the wilderness. Leading the patrol was Sergei Antonov, a 44-year-old officer with more than 15 years of field experience. Calm under pressure and respected among his peers, he had spent much of his life navigating these forests. Beside him sat Dmitry Sokolov, 37, strong and disciplined, a former border guard known for his precision and speed. In the back was Ivan Petrov, 29, newer to the unit but sharp and observant, skilled at reading tracks through snow and frozen terrain. The three had worked together through blizzards, night raids, and long winter patrols. But this mission felt different. The forest was unnaturally quiet. They followed faint tire impressions leading toward a wide, half-frozen river. Snowfall thickened, visibility shrinking to only a few meters. Branches sagged with ice, and their breath fogged the inside of the truck's windows. The men scanned the tree line, moving slowly to avoid alerting anyone ahead. Their radios crackled weakly with static, struggling for signal in the dense wilderness. The air felt heavy, as if the entire forest were holding its breath. The truck crawled along the icy embankment until Ivan noticed something in the snow, tracks too large to belong to humans. They were deep, wide, and pressed sharply into the powder. The men exchanged quick glances. This was bear country. In winter, hunger made the animals unpredictable, aggressive, desperate, and quick to strike at any sound or scent. Sergei leaned forward, bracing instinctively. Out of the darkness beyond the trees, a massive shape emerged. A giant grizzly stepped from the forest's edge, its thick fur crusted with ice and mud. Its ribs showed faintly through its coat, a sign of late-season hunger. The falling snow blurred its outline, turning it into a shifting mass of shadow and motion. Its shoulders rolled with muscle, and its breath steamed into the wind like smoke. The officers reacted instantly. The truck halted, rifles came up, but as Sergei pulled the trigger, the firing mechanism jammed. In that half-second of failure, the Grizzly surged forward like an avalanche. It slammed into the truck with explosive force. Metal screamed and twisted as the vehicle lurched sideways and flipped into the snow. a blast of white engulfing everything. The impact echoed through the valley as the truck crashed hard onto its side. Gear scattered across the ice. Radios, flares, and ammunition spilling into the drifts. Before the men could recover, the Grizzly struck again, its enormous weight slamming into the overturned vehicle with a dull, crushing sound. The steel paneling dented inward, the entire frame shaking as branches snapped in the trees nearby. Dmitri was the first to move. He clawed his way through a shattered window, boots sinking deep into the snow as he lifted his rifle. He fired multiple rounds into the storm, the orange flashes lighting up the fog. Snow and ice burst upward with each shot, but the bear didn't falter. In a single motion, it swung a heavy paw across Dmitri's chest and threw him backward onto the frozen ground. He slid across the ice and lay still. Inside the truck, Ivan fought to free himself from a jammed seatbelt. The world roared with ringing noise and drifting snow. He grabbed a flare gun from the floor and kicked open the half-crushed side door. The moment he emerged, he fired the flare into the air, a streak of red tearing through the storm, casting a brief crimson glow across the trees. The signal hissed and vanished over the ridge. The bear, still in a frenzy, crashed against the truck again. The metal frame groaned, windows shattering. Ivan stumbled backward, struggling to drag Dmitri away from the wreck, but the animal turned sharply toward him, pounding through the snow with terrifying speed. Inside the ruined cab, Sergei, half-pinned under the steering column, forced his arm free. His hand closed on a backup flare. He struck it hard against the doorframe. A sudden burst of light exploded through the wreckage just as the bear reared over Ivan. Fire flared across the snow. The bright blaze seared into the animal's face. The bear recoiled, snarling, blinded for an instant, but that second was enough. It turned, its massive frame shaking the earth, and thundered back into the trees, vanishing into the storm's gray veil. Silence reclaimed the forest. Only the hiss of the burning flare and the groan of bending metal broke the stillness. Snow fell again, soft and steady, covering shattered glass and torn earth as the men lay among the wreckage. Sergei managed to pull himself halfway out of the truck, face pale from blood loss. He called weakly into the wind, but only Ivan stirred. Dmitri did not move. Hours passed before a backup team reached the scene. The storm had slowed their progress, forcing them to hike the final distance on foot. They found Ivan barely conscious, hands blue from the cold. Sergei was alive but gravely injured, unable to stand. Dmitri was confirmed dead on arrival, his wounds catastrophic. The truck lay half-buried in snow, deep claw marks gouged into its steel panels. The bear was gone. Only the wreckage and the wide tracks carved into the snow marked where it had passed. In the days that followed, news spread quietly through nearby villages. People spoke of the forest, reminding men of its power, how swiftly the calm of winter could turn to chaos, how hunger could drive the wild to strike first. In that frozen corner of the world, the silence of the woods once again demanded respect. It was September 14th, 2024, deep in a remote mountain region of the American Northwest, where tall spruce trees stood like walls around a narrow clearing. A cold wind moved across the valley before dawn, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. A small military field unit had established a temporary camp the previous evening, far from any town or road. The operation was a routine endurance exercise, designed to test discipline and survival under harsh, unpredictable conditions. Though not a combat mission, the wilderness demanded the same level of alertness. Among the team was Sergeant Daniel Mercer, 32, a calm, disciplined squad leader from Colorado. He had years of field experience leading outdoor operations through rugged terrain. Responsible for overseeing 4 younger soldiers during the early morning drills, he maintained quiet confidence and focus. Most of his team were in their mid-20s, still gaining experience through their 3rd major field rotation before winter training began. They arrived before nightfall and pitched standard-issue tents along the edge of the forest. Their gear was stacked neatly beside the shelters, and sealed rations were stored near a covered supply tarp. The air smelled faintly of fuel, canvas, and damp moss. As the last light faded, the forest settled into stillness. Only the steady breath of wind and the occasional creak of a tree branch broke the silence around camp. By 3 a.m., most soldiers were asleep. The campfire had burned down to glowing embers, and the moon lay hidden behind a thick shroud of clouds. The clearing was silent until the first soft, heavy footfalls crossed the edge of the tree line. No one heard them at first. A large grizzly bear had moved into the clearing, drawn by the faint scent of the ration crates. Without warning, the animal lunged toward the nearest tent. The canvas rippled and collapsed as the bear struck with its full weight. Poles snapped. Gear spilled across the ground. 2 soldiers inside were instantly pinned beneath their packs as the structure folded around them. The bear exhaled a deep growl and began tearing at the fabric, claws ripping through the canvas with terrifying ease. Shouts erupted from the other tents as soldiers woke in confusion. One struggled with a jammed zipper, while another stumbled barefoot onto the cold earth, fumbling for his helmet. Equipment bags and webbing straps tangled underfoot as the group tried to orient themselves. Inside the collapsed tent, one pinned soldier managed to reach a pack and fumble for a canister of bear spray. Outside, the roar of the animal filled the air, echoing through the trees as it continued ripping into the shelter. The bear slammed its weight against the torn structure again, flattening the gear beneath it. Metal buckles scraped across rock. With a desperate shove, the trapped soldier freed one arm and fired a burst of bear spray through a tear in the fabric. The sharp chemical mist filled the cold air, coating the animal's face. The grizzly recoiled with a guttural snarl, staggering backward as it tossed its head and pawed at the ground. 2 soldiers near the supply tarp responded instantly. They grabbed helmets and banged them against metal crates, producing sharp, echoing crashes. Another kicked repeatedly at an empty fuel drum, the hollow sound booming through the dark clearing. The noise, combined with the spray, created enough confusion to draw the bear's attention away. It turned sharply and charged toward the supply area instead, swiping a massive paw across the side of the drum. The metal rolled end over end through the mud as a storage crate split open, scattering sealed ration packs in every direction. Plastic tore. Metal groaned. Sergeant Mercer, now fully alert and steady, directed the remaining soldiers into staggered positions behind tree trunks at the clearing's edge. Weapons were raised but not fired. Live ammunition was restricted during training. Instead, they focused on appearing large and loud without provoking further aggression. The bear hesitated near the supply zone, breathing heavily, its nostrils flaring as it searched for the source of scent. It prowled back toward the center of camp, crushing a broken tent pole under its weight. Another soldier discharged a second burst of bear spray from a few meters away. The irritant struck cleanly. The grizzly reeled again, shaking its head violently before retreating toward the tree line. It hesitated once more, pacing in frustration, then finally vanished into the dense forest as the first faint glow of dawn began to touch the ridges. The entire attack had lasted less than 10 minutes, but for those caught inside, it felt much longer. Once the clearing was secure, Mercer ordered immediate injury checks. The 2 pinned soldiers were bruised and cut by torn gear and debris, but neither had broken bones. One shoulder was badly swollen where the weight of the tent frame had pressed down. The camp itself looked like a disaster zone. Shredded fabric, splintered poles, ration packs scattered across the mud, and the dented fuel drum lying several yards away from its original position. By sunrise, officers had assembled the full unit to debrief. The lessons were direct. Store food at greater distance, seal containers more securely, and maintain perimeter watches even during training. What began as a routine endurance exercise had turned into a vivid demonstration of how fast the wilderness could erase any sense of control. Later reports confirmed that all personnel survived with minor to moderate injuries and were safely evacuated once the site was stabilized. The incident became a required case study for future wilderness operations, emphasizing that even disciplined, well-equipped teams remain vulnerable when the boundaries between human order and raw nature blur. On the cold, fog-choked morning of November 1st, 2025, the Montana wilderness lay silent beneath a thin layer of frost that glittered under the faint light of a waning moon. Inside a small, isolated cabin perched near the edge of a dense pine forest, Mark and Rachel Turner slept unaware of the approaching danger that had picked up their scent from the stored game meat hanging just beyond the back porch, its odor drifting on the icy wind into the ears and nose of a massive grizzly that had been roaming the mountains for days, seeking an easy meal before winter deepened. The bear moved with a terrifying combination of stealth and raw power, its heavy paws pressing into the frozen ground with soft thuds that were nearly lost beneath the occasional groan of the cabin settling in the cold. Then, in an instant, the quiet was shattered as the animal surged forward, crashing through the underbrush with a force that rattled tree branches and sent birds into the night sky. Before either Mark or Rachel could fully awaken, the enormous bulk of the Grizzly struck the porch, splintering railings, snapping the support beams, and shaking the cabin in a way that felt as if the very earth had moved beneath them. Mark's eyes flew open to the sound of splintering wood and a guttural roar that vibrated through his chest. At the same time, Rachel bolted upright, clutching the blankets to her chest as fear constricted her throat. Together, they realized the unimaginable truth. A predator larger than any they had ever imagined was inside their home, drawn by hunger and the irresistible scent of meat. The bear's massive claws scraped against the door as it tore at the wood with terrifying efficiency, each swipe sending shards of splintered timber across the floorboards and leaving gouges deep enough to expose the cabin's interior to the cold night air. Mark lunged for the rifle that leaned against the wall, fumbling briefly as his fingers, stiff with sleep and panic, struggled to secure the safety and rack a shell into the chamber. At the same time, Rachel crawled toward the heavier table in the corner, instinct telling her to take cover, every instinct screaming that this was a fight for survival. The bear's first swipe through the doorway sent the old wooden table Mark had used for chopping firewood crashing to the floor, tossing kindling and other supplies like paper in a storm. And as the creature entered the cabin, the weight of its bulk pressed down on the floorboards, making them groan under an impact that felt impossibly heavy. At the same time, it slammed into a stack of chairs, sending them skidding across the room and scattering Rachel's carefully prepared emergency supplies. Rachel dove beneath the nearest solid surface, pressing her back against the cold wood as she watched the Grizzly circle, each breath rattling in her chest, while the bear's low growls and panting filled the room, punctuated by the crashing of furniture, the snapping of timber, and the occasional thud of the bear's paw against a wall or window. Sparks from a lantern, jarred from its hook during the chaos, skittered across the floorboards, igniting scattered papers that curled and blackened as smoke began to fill the cabin, adding a choking, acrid layer to the already overwhelming terror. Mark fired the rifle once, the report echoing through the cabin and into the surrounding trees. But the bear, driven by either hunger or the sheer shock of opportunity, barely flinched. With a swipe of its massive paw, it knocked the rifle aside, sending it sliding across the floor as Mark was forced back against the wall, feeling the full power of the animal in a way that made every muscle in his body tense with the urgent need to survive. The bear seized the moment to grab the carcass of a frozen deer that had been left on the porch, dragging it inside with terrifying strength, shaking it as if it were nothing more than a toy. At the same time, splintered wood and scattered belongings created a chaotic battlefield around it. Rachel pressed herself closer to the table's support beams, her hands gripping the rough edges as if the wood could somehow anchor her against the storm of raw power that moved through the cabin. Every second stretched unbearably long, each movement of the Grizzly an unpredictable threat that could crush, swipe, or gore in an instant, leaving the Turners caught in a suspended nightmare where awareness of their isolation amplified every heartbeat and every thought of what might happen next. Minutes felt like hours as the bear tore through the cabin, smashing through windows, scattering supplies, and dragging the deer back toward the doorway, its claws leaving deep gouges along walls and ceilings, the smell of blood, sweat, and animal musk filling the room and mingling with smoke from the burning papers. Mark found a moment to scramble for a second rifle, this one heavier and loaded with a larger caliber, and braced himself, knowing he could not afford to miss. Still, the bear, sensing the threat, hesitated only briefly before retreating, seemingly satisfied with the damage and chaos it had wrought, and perhaps realizing the humans were not as easy prey as it had assumed. With one final earth-shaking roar that reverberated through the trees, the Grizzly bolted through the broken doorway into the frost-covered night, disappearing into the shadows of the surrounding forest. At the same time, the Turners, bruised, scratched, and shaking from adrenaline and fear, slowly emerged from their makeshift shelter beneath the table. By dawn, the cabin lay in near-total ruin. Glass lay scattered like ice crystals across the floor. Walls bore deep claw marks. Furniture was smashed and overturned. Supplies were strewn across every surface, and the lingering smoke of the burned papers mixed with the cold mountain air to create a haze that made breathing difficult. Mark and Rachel huddled together in silence, each instinctively checking the other for injuries, realizing that survival had been a mixture of quick thinking, luck, and sheer endurance, while also understanding in a deeper, more frightening way just how vulnerable isolation in Grizzly country could make even the most prepared and experienced people. The forest outside returned to its quiet, frost-bound calm, leaving only the wreckage of the cabin and the vivid memory of the bear's unstoppable presence as evidence that, in the remote Montana mountains, life could be broken, torn, and nearly stolen in the course of a single terrifying night. On October 3, 2024, Olivia Bennett climbed a steep granite ridge in Montana, moving carefully with every foot and hand placement. Her rope was coiled over her shoulder, and a light pack was secured tightly against her back. The early afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the rock face, and the air carried the sharp scent of pine and earth, mixed with the faint chill that hinted winter would arrive soon. Olivia was scouting a new route, solo, testing the granite for cracks and ledges that might support a future ascent, and each careful movement reminded her how exposed she was on the narrow, unbroken ridge. The mountains around her seemed still, quiet and unyielding, the silence only broken by distant bird calls and the scrape of rock under her boots. Halfway up the ridge, as she paused to check her chalked hands and adjust her rope, a low guttural grunt echoed from a nearby outcropping, resonating through the rocks and tightening the muscles in her shoulders. Olivia froze, every instinct alert, her eyes scanning the ridge below and the scrubby forest at its base. And through the thin trees, she saw it, a massive black bear, drawn by the faint scent of food she had left near her base camp. The animal moved with deliberate strength, pawing at loose rocks and testing the ridge as if to measure its limits, each movement causing small stones to tumble downward and echo against the mountainside. Olivia's chest tightened, her fingers curling instinctively around her rope, and she realized how quickly solitude in these mountains could turn from peaceful to dangerous. The bear's eyes locked on her, and for a tense moment it stood still, its black fur gleaming faintly in the sun, muscles rippling beneath the thick coat as it judged its approach. Then it lunged. Olivia's heart raced as she scrambled toward a narrow ledge that offered slightly more security, her fingers trembling as they found tiny holds in the granite, her boots slipping occasionally on the smooth surface. The bear swiped at her with powerful claws, scraping along her jacket and shredding the fabric within inches of her body. She pressed herself flat against the rock, the scent of pine and adrenaline thick in her nose, her muscles straining to keep her balance. Each swipe sent loose stones clattering down the slope, and the sheer drop beside her reminded her that one mistake could be fatal. Olivia inched along the ledge, balancing precariously, every movement calculated to avoid a fall while putting distance between herself and the bear, her heart hammering so loudly she feared it might give her position away. The bear followed, circling and pawing at the ridge, growling low and deep, testing her patience and her resolve, its head tilting and eyes glinting as if it were sizing her up as prey. The minutes stretched long, each second weighted with fear, the wind carrying the bear's scent to her in sharp waves that seemed to fill her chest with icy tension. She focused on each handhold and foothold, forcing herself to move carefully despite the trembling of her arms and legs. Finally, she reached a small overhang, a natural shelter just wide enough to keep the bear from reaching her with its massive paws, and she collapsed briefly against the granite, gasping for air as adrenaline surged and left her muscles trembling. Below, the bear circled once more, pawing rocks and sniffing at the ledge where she had been exposed, before eventually retreating toward the forest, drawn away by the faint scent of her base camp, or perhaps deciding the effort was not worth the risk. Olivia remained still for several minutes after the bear's departure, her body coated in sweat and fine dust from the granite, scrapes marking her arms and legs. She realized fully how vulnerable even an experienced climber could be when an apex predator intersected with exposed terrain. When she finally climbed down to firmer ground, her arms sore and clothes torn, she paused to survey the ridge she had just survived, noting how quickly isolation could become lethal, how even precise technique and years of climbing experience offered no guarantee against the raw power and unpredictability of wildlife in its natural environment. Her pack and gear were intact, thankfully. Still, the memory of the bear's claws swiping mere inches from her body remained vivid, a chilling reminder of the danger that lurked beyond the beauty of the Montana wilderness. Every sound of snapping branches or shifting rock reminded her of the encounter, and she moved deliberately as she descended, knowing that survival in these mountains was never guaranteed, and that the combination of steep terrain, solitude, and a predator's instinct could turn a routine climb into a fight to live. By the time Olivia reached the base of the ridge, her muscles burned, and her clothes were stained with dust and blood from minor scrapes. Still, her mind remained alert, cataloging every detail of the bear's approach, every sound, every movement, and every second that had stretched like an eternity. The encounter had reinforced a truth she had long known but rarely confronted so vividly. In the wild, skill and experience could delay disaster, but they could not remove the threat entirely. Apex predators demanded respect, caution, and constant awareness, and even a climber like Olivia Bennett, trained and confident, had been reminded that the margins between life and death in the mountains were dangerously thin, and that any misstep, any moment of hesitation, could have had fatal consequences. On February 18, 2025, the Montana backcountry lay pristine and untouched, sunlight glinting off fresh snow that blanketed steep slopes, turning the mountains into a dazzling white expanse that hid every contour and shadow with deceptive beauty. 3 skiers, Anna, Lucas, and Miguel, moved cautiously down a remote descent far from any groomed trails, their breaths rising in clouds as they navigated narrow gullies, snow-laden trees, and hidden drops, their skis cutting shallow grooves into powder that had fallen silently over the previous night. Each turn required focus, as every slope was assessed for hidden obstacles. Meanwhile, the early afternoon light cast long, shifting shadows across the terrain, masking dangers that could be concealed just beyond the tree line. The air carried the faint scent of pine and snow, mixed with the tang of energy bars and sandwiches packed for the day. And beneath it all, the mountains remained indifferent, vast and silent, harboring whatever creatures moved unseen within their folds. As the trio neared a partially frozen creek that cut through a grove of spruce, a low, resonant growl broke the quiet, shaking the air in a way that caused snow to shift from branches overhead and made their hearts leap. Anna's gaze swept the trees, and through the gaps, she saw it, a massive grizzly, its dark fur glinting faintly under the afternoon sun, muscles tensing with each movement as it sniffed the air, drawn by the smell of packed lunches and the backpack a previous group of hikers had left hidden near the creek. The bear moved with terrifying deliberation, each step crunching against the frozen undergrowth as it stepped closer to the edge of the tree line, its nostrils flaring, its eyes fixed on the nearest skier. The 3 friends froze instinctively, aware immediately that the quiet, beautiful mountainscape had transformed into a battlefield where survival depended on rapid decisions and split-second reactions. Without warning, the bear charged. Its roar echoed across the slopes, ricocheting between cliffs and gullies like a rolling avalanche, sending birds flapping into the air and snow cascading from the higher slopes. Lucas, nearest to the creek, stumbled over a hidden rock, dropping his ski poles as he tumbled sideways, and the bear's first swipe tore through his jacket and dug deep into his shoulder, pain flaring instantly as he tried to roll free while clutching the wound. Anna and Miguel reacted immediately, raising their ski poles and flares, swinging them to create noise and movement that might distract the predator, each motion tense, arms trembling, breath coming fast in the icy air. The bear paused for a heartbeat, snorting and pawing at the snow, then lunged again, faster than either of them could anticipate, claws raking across the slope in a blur of strength and power that left gouges in the powder and sent small rocks and ice tumbling downhill. Minutes stretched unbearably, each second loaded with fear, as the bear circled, lunged, and retreated only to strike again, its eyes never leaving its perceived prey. At the same time, the skiers did their best to navigate the steep terrain. Anna's gloved hands were raw from swinging poles. Miguel's legs burned as he pivoted and skidded to avoid the bear's swipes, and Lucas, bleeding and grimacing, struggled to maintain footing on the icy, uneven snow as he tried to shield himself with whatever movement he could muster. Snow sprayed around them with every strike, echoing against the trees and cliffs, while the roar of the bear dominated the mountainscape. This primal sound reminded them of the sheer scale and lethality of the apex predator before them. At one point, the bear seized Lucas's backpack, dragging it several feet across the snow while sniffing at the half-eaten sandwich inside, then paused, growling and pawing at the slope as if testing whether the humans posed any real threat. The skiers pressed themselves against nearby trees and rocks wherever possible, using the terrain as cover while attempting to redirect the bear's attention with poles and flares. Still, each movement required extreme care, knowing that one misstep could mean being struck again or worse, thrown down the steep incline. The bear's focus was relentless, its energy seemingly endless, its instincts honed by survival in the harsh Montana wilderness, and the skiers realized that luck and quick thinking were their only shields against the force bearing down upon them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bear retreated uphill, disappearing into the grove of spruce with Lucas's backpack clutched in its massive jaws, leaving only claw marks in the snow and the smell of exertion and fur behind. The three skiers collapsed to the slope, shaking, bruised, and bleeding, hearts racing as they took in the aftermath. Deep gouges along the powder, broken branches, disturbed snow, and the echoes of their fear still resonating across the empty mountains. Lucas's shoulder bled freely. Anna's hands were scraped raw from gripping ski poles, and Miguel's thighs burned from the frantic maneuvering that had kept him alive. Still, all three were profoundly aware of the narrow margin that had separated survival from catastrophe, and how even the pristine, open slopes of the backcountry could conceal a predator capable of destroying them in moments. As they gathered themselves and slowly made their way down toward safer terrain, leaning on each other where possible, they reflected silently on the encounter, understanding that in the wilderness, preparation, awareness, and instinct could save lives, but that nature's unpredictability demanded respect and humility at every step. The snow-covered slope, which had appeared inviting and beautiful only minutes before, now felt treacherous, every shadow a potential hiding place, every sound a possible warning. And the lesson they carried with them was both clear and terrifying. Apex predators are not bound by human schedules, distances, or perceptions of safety, and even the most careful adventurers can find themselves in a life-or-death struggle when a hungry, powerful animal chooses to assert its dominance in its territory. On November 2nd, 2025, the interior of Alaska was already gripped by early snow, with low gray clouds pressing over the mountains and the scent of cold pine drifting through the valleys. A wildlife tour bus wound slowly along a narrow gravel road north of Talkeetna, carrying 8 passengers eager to catch their final glimpse of the Alaskan wilderness before winter sealed it in silence. The driver, Paul Mercer, a 45-year-old, had made the trip dozens of times before. Navigating through frost-rimmed spruce and alder thickets, his passengers bundled in parkas and gloves, their cameras aimed toward the white horizon. It was the last scheduled tour of the season, a quiet route where the animals were fewer but the land more haunting in its stillness. They had been driving for nearly 2 hours when Mercer noticed movement on the far side of a frozen marsh, a moose, its broad antlers dark against the snow-dusted reeds. Excited murmurs rippled through the bus, and he eased the vehicle to a stop on the shoulder, leaving the engine idling as the tourists pressed against the windows with their cameras. The air outside was still, and the faint sound of shutters clicking mixed with the wind whispering through dry grass. Mercer stood near the door, scanning the tree line beyond the marsh, his experience telling him that wildlife rarely stayed predictable this late in the year. Yet nothing seemed out of place until the quiet shifted, a sound almost too low to notice at first, the snap of branches, heavy and deliberate, coming from the dense alder brush only 30 feet away. From that shadowed thicket emerged a massive grizzly bear, its fur patchy and dull, the long hump of its shoulders glistening with frost. Its head swung low, nostrils flaring, its breath rising in pale clouds as it moved closer to the road. Mercer froze, recognizing at once that the bear's movements were not curious but tense, erratic, as if confusion or hunger were driving it. The tourists on board, unaware of the change in its posture, lifted their lenses eagerly toward the glass, believing they had been granted a rare sighting. But the bear's ears flattened, and with slow, uneven steps it began to circle the front of the bus, its claws scraping the gravel, its body weaving like a creature on edge. Mercer shut off the engine to minimize the vibration, hoping the bear would lose interest, but the sudden silence seemed to agitate it further. It paused by the front bumper, then rose on its hind legs, towering against the windshield, its size dwarfing everything around it. The passengers gasped as its massive paws landed with a hollow thud against the metal, and the sound echoed through the empty valley. For several seconds, it stared through the glass, eyes dark and unsteady, before dropping down and pacing toward the door. Mercer's instincts screamed to start the bus and drive, but the bear was already too close. Its claws hooked against the narrow steps as it struck the side mirror, breaking it loose. The bus rocked slightly, and one passenger stumbled against the seat, pressing their bleeding hand against the shards of broken glass that had showered down when the window cracked. The bear roared then, a deep, guttural sound that rattled the thin walls of the vehicle. Its head thrust forward, jaws snapping at the shattered door, and for an instant its foreleg came through the gap, swiping wildly. A woman near the front seat screamed as the claws caught her arm, slicing through her jacket and skin. Blood spotted the floor as Mercer slammed his hand against the horn, the blaring noise piercing the quiet air like a blade. The bear recoiled but didn't run. It dropped to all fours again and began pacing in circles, snorting and huffing clouds of steam, clearly distressed by the noise but still unwilling to leave. Mercer hit the horn again, holding it down longer, the echoes bouncing off the snowy ridges around them. Finally, the bear backed into the brush, its movement reluctant, its head turning several times before vanishing into the thicket from which it had come. Inside the bus, the passenger sat frozen, breathing hard, as the shock slowly settled in, the wind whistling through the cracks in the broken window. The woman who had been struck held her arm tightly, trembling, while another tourist had shallow cuts from flying glass. Mercer reached for the radio mounted by his seat and called for help, his voice low and steady, though his hands still shook. The nearest ranger station was over an hour away, but a helicopter was dispatched to meet them along the open stretch of road a few miles ahead. He started the bus, the engine groaning before catching, and eased it forward, his eyes flicking constantly toward the mirrors, half expecting the bear to reappear. By the time the helicopter reached them, snow had begun to fall again, coating the trees in a thin, glittering layer. The injured passengers were lifted out and flown toward Anchorage for treatment. Later, wildlife officials arrived to examine the tracks left near the road, deep impressions, uneven, circling patterns that suggested agitation more than aggression. They found tufts of coarse fur snagged on the broken mirror, indicating that the bear had been underweight for its size, possibly struggling to find enough food late in the season before hibernation. The early snow had sealed off the higher berry patches, and fish had grown scarce in the streams. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion often pushed bears closer to human activity in early November, and in this case the noise of the bus might have startled it out of dense cover where it had been searching for roots or carrion. In the following days, news of the attack spread quickly through Alaska's small tourism network, reigniting debate about the safety of late-season wildlife tours. Some argued that such excursions placed unnecessary stress on animals already struggling to survive. In contrast, others claimed this was an isolated event, a tragic collision between curiosity and instinct at the edge of wilderness. Paul Mercer didn't return to work for several weeks, and when he finally did, he avoided that particular route, knowing the sight of alderbrush swaying in the cold wind would always bring back the echo of claws scraping steel. October 15, 2023, the narrow coves of Kodiak Island were wrapped in thick morning fog, the air heavy with salt and the faint scent of rotting salmon carried by the tide. The sea lapped softly against the pebbled shore, and from the distant hills came the low moan of wind through spruce. Thomas Keller, 44 years old, stood by his weathered skiff, its paint dulled by years of salt spray, preparing his nets for another long day of work. For 15 seasons, he had returned to this same remote stretch of coastline, a hidden cove known to few but spoken of fondly by those who fished there. To him, it was more than a fishing spot. It was a ritual, a place where he felt part of something older and quieter than himself. Keller was known among the locals in Larsen Bay as a man who respected the bears that ruled the island. He never carried a rifle unless traveling deep inland, and even then it stayed slung over his shoulder, rarely touched. He believed in keeping distance, in sharing the space rather than fighting for it. He spoke of the great brown bears as if they were neighbors with predictable moods, creatures to be acknowledged, not feared. Over the years, a few bears had become familiar to him, massive shapes that passed through the alder groves or along the tidal flats, leaving deep prints in the sand. He watched them often, always from afar, understanding that on Kodiak, coexistence was built on respect and rhythm. That autumn had been colder than usual, and the salmon run came later, forcing the bears to linger near the streams longer than expected. Keller spent most of his days alone, drying fish near camp and setting nets just beyond the mouth of the cove. His camp was marked by a small tarp shelter and the faint smell of wood smoke drifting through the mist. He made careful efforts to leave fish remains far from camp, dragging them down shore where the tide could take them, ensuring no bear would be tempted to get too close. Yet as the fog thickened and daylight shortened, the island's silence seemed to change, as if something vast and unseen moved just beyond the trees. That morning, visibility barely stretched beyond 30 yards. Keller's breath formed pale clouds as he checked the lines strung between driftwood poles, where salmon fillets hung to dry. He wore his old canvas jacket, its cuffs frayed from years of use, and boots caked in sand. Somewhere out on the flats, gulls cried sharply, their wings flashing like white sparks through the gray air. The tide had dropped lower than usual, leaving a stretch of glistening mud that gleamed faintly in the weak light. It was in that half-silence that he heard it, a low rustle, followed by the slow crunch of weight shifting through the reeds near the waterline. He turned toward the sound, his eyes narrowing, and caught a shadowed shape moving through the fog. A bear, massive and dark, its fur heavy with moisture, its breath visible in rhythmic bursts. It was close, closer than he realized, and for a brief moment neither moved. He had seen bears many times before, but this one felt different, heavier, slower, as though hunger rather than curiosity drove it. The bear advanced a few steps, head swinging low, testing the air, its attention drawn toward the fish rack behind him. Keller knew better than to shout or run, yet instinct told him to make his presence clear. Somewhere in those seconds, he likely reached for the small handheld radio or satellite phone kept by his tent. Later, rescuers would find a voice note recorded on it, a faint and crackling message in which his calm voice mentioned one big brown moving through the reeds. After that, silence. When Keller failed to check in that evening, the harbor operator grew uneasy. The next morning, a search crew flew out along the coast, following his usual fishing route. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing a stretch of shoreline marked by strange disturbances, shredded netting tangled among rocks, an overturned skiff half buried in wet sand, and boot prints scattered in looping patterns that ended in a churned patch near the tide line. Around it lay drag marks, deep and erratic, fading toward the edge of the marsh where reeds bent in broken swaths. The investigators moved carefully, aware that a bear could still be near, the air thick with the metallic scent of salt and something else they chose not to name aloud. They recovered the satellite phone lodged under a pile of wet kelp, its casing cracked but still functional enough to reveal the short voice note. It lasted only 6 seconds, ending abruptly as though interrupted mid-thought. No rifle was found nearby, only Keller's fishing vest and the remains of his gear strewn across the sand. A few hundred yards inland, they discovered a feeding site, freshly turned earth and fish remnants, the kind of place where a bear might return repeatedly. Investigators later concluded that Keller must have approached too close, perhaps to retrieve a torn section of net or check on a snagged fish, and startled the animal as it guarded its food. The tracks suggested a sudden burst of movement, an attack that lasted only moments. The bear was not hunted afterward. Wildlife officers decided the encounter was defensive, not predatory, and the island's fragile balance depended on avoiding unnecessary killings. Locals mourned Keller quietly, holding a small gathering at the dock where his skiff had once been tied. They spoke of him not as a reckless man, but as someone who trusted too deeply in the patterns of the wild, believing that respect alone would keep danger at bay. His friends said he moved through the wilderness with the patience of a man who listened before he acted, who knew the weight of solitude and found comfort in its company. In the years that followed, his camp remained untouched, slowly reclaiming the land with moss and wind. On October 22, 2019, the morning mist hung low over the cracked tarmac of a small regional airfield deep in Ussuri-Krai, eastern Russia. The facility, isolated among endless pine and birch, served only a handful of supply flights each week. Its workers were accustomed to the silence, to the distant crows and the whisper of the wind through the surrounding forest. That morning, ground technician Yuri Antonov, 47, had been inspecting one of the aging hangar doors when he noticed movement at the tree line beyond the fence. The light was gray and uneven, the kind that makes shadows seem to breathe. At first, he thought it was a stray dog scavenging through the rubbish pile near the maintenance sheds, but as the shape rose and shifted, he saw the unmistakable bulk of a brown bear, broad shoulders, thick fur matted with mud, and eyes that caught the light with a dull reflection. It was a Russian grizzly, and it had found its way through a section of fence damaged weeks earlier by a fallen tree. The airfield's small team had complained about the gap, but repairs had been delayed until the next supply delivery. Now the oversight had opened a path from wilderness to machinery. The bear's ribs showed through its fur, and it moved with the slow, restless gait of an animal half-starved. The season had been harsh, salmon runs were poor, berries scarce. As autumn turned colder, many bears in the region grew desperate, wandering closer to settlements and work camps in search of anything edible. The airfield's refuse bins overflowed with discarded packaging, oil-soaked rags, and food scraps from workers' meals. The scent had drifted into the forest, and hunger had done the rest. Antonov radioed 2 co-workers, Pavel and Mikhail, who were checking equipment inside the hangar. They emerged cautiously, each grabbing what they could find. One carried a hand flare, the other a metal bar. The men tried to scare the bear back toward the trees, shouting and banging on the truck's side panels. At first it hesitated, shifting its weight as though considering retreat. Then something in its demeanor changed. With a guttural sound, it lowered its head and began moving toward them in a heavy, deliberate stride that quickened with each step. Antonov leaped into the driver's seat of the old utility truck, turning the engine over until it sputtered to life. He revved it hard, pushing forward to block the bear's path. For a second it seemed to work. The animal stopped, rearing slightly, nostrils flaring. Then it struck, slamming into the truck's front quarter panel with enough force to dent the metal and rock the vehicle sideways. The noise of claws scraping steel echoed through the airfield. Pavel fired a flare, the bright red light hissing across the tarmac, but the bear ignored it, circling toward the open door of the truck. Antonov tried to reverse, but the tires spun on the damp surface. The bear lunged again, swiping through the open window, striking his shoulder and neck. The force threw him sideways, and blood streaked the glass. Mikhail ran forward, shouting and waving his arms, but the bear turned on him with terrifying speed. It knocked him to the ground, snapping at his leg before the roar of nearby turbine engines filled the air. Two pilots, preparing for an outbound flight, had seen the chaos and started the aircraft's engines. The blast of heat and the deafening roar drove through the mist, startling the bear. It backed away, shaking its head, then turned and lumbered toward the broken fence, vanishing into the forest as quickly as it had come. Silence returned, broken only by the thrum of the engines winding down and the distant caw of ravens circling overhead. Antonov was barely conscious when the others reached him. His injuries were severe, deep lacerations across his chest and throat, blood soaking his uniform. The small airfield had no medical staff, only a radio link to a hospital over an hour's flight away. Despite his co-workers' efforts, he died before help could arrive. Mikhail survived, his leg torn but treatable, and was later evacuated by helicopter. In the following days, regional wildlife officers tracked the bear's trail through the forest, finding signs of scavenging and a half-collapsed den near a stream. They eventually tranquilized it several kilometers away, thin and exhausted, its paws stained with oil and mud. The animal was relocated to a remote reserve north of Primorsky Krai, though biologists doubted it would survive the coming winter. They cited worsening food shortages, shrinking habitat, and growing contact between humans and large predators as the region's forests were steadily cleared for logging. Investigators concluded that the attack could have been prevented. The damaged fence, the unsecured waste, and the lack of proper deterrence measures had all played a part. The Aviation Authority imposed stricter rules on all rural airstrips, including mandatory fencing repairs, controlled waste disposal, and emergency training for personnel stationed in areas with bear populations. For those who worked at the Ussuri Krai airfield, the incident left an emptiness that hung over every shift. Antonov had been a quiet, reliable man who preferred fixing engines to talking. He had once joked that the forest was his only neighbor, that its silence helped him think more clearly. After his death, workers noticed how the silence felt heavier. They spoke less, stayed closer to the sheds, and kept the floodlights burning long into the night. The story of the attack spread through nearby towns, a grim reminder of how thin the boundary had become between human work and wild survival. In a place where the taiga still stretches farther than roads, the cost of forgetting that truth could be fatal. The airfield continued operating, but every new sound in the dark, the crack of a branch, the shuffle of something unseen beyond the fence, carried a quiet weight of fear, a warning written in the cold breath of the Russian wilderness. The region of far eastern Russia had always been an unforgiving territory, a sprawling wilderness where the taiga stretched endlessly in all directions, and winter arrived without warning. On October 27, 2025, the region was experiencing one of its earliest snowfalls in decades, blanketing the dense forests in thick white powder that muffled sound and reduced visibility to mere meters. This was the landscape where 5 forestry workers found themselves that morning, tasked with clearing a remote logging road that had become impassable after weeks of neglect and the sudden onset of winter weather. Sergei Volkov, the crew supervisor at 43, had been working in these forests for over 2 decades. He knew the risks that came with the territory, from equipment failures in sub-zero temperatures to the occasional encounter with wildlife. Beside him in the snowcat sat Yulia Ivanenko, 36, the crew's equipment specialist who could fix just about anything with spare parts and determination. In the rear compartment, Dmitry Karpov, Elena Morozova, and Alexei Petrov worked on organizing chainsaws and clearing tools, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, despite the vehicle's struggling heater. The snowcat had been performing admirably, given the conditions, its tracks churning through the accumulating snow as they pushed deeper into the forest. They were approximately 30 kilometers from the nearest settlement, working on a section of road that serviced a logging operation further north. The company had been expanding its reach into previously untouched forest areas. This move had drawn criticism from environmental groups, but continued nonetheless due to economic pressures and demand for timber. Around mid-morning, the snowcat began making an ominous grinding noise. Sergei brought the vehicle to a halt and announced they would need to inspect the tracks. The wind had picked up considerably, howling through the trees and sending cascades of snow falling from overloaded branches. Visibility was rapidly deteriorating as gusts whipped up swirling snow devils that danced across the road. What none of them knew was that a massive Russian grizzly bear had been tracking their progress for the past hour. The animal, a male weighing close to 400 kilograms, had been displaced from its usual territory by the logging operations. The early snow had also disrupted its feeding patterns, leaving it desperately hungry and irritable as it should have been, consuming vast quantities of food to prepare for hibernation. Instead, it was starving and growing increasingly aggressive. Dmitry and Elena had just climbed out of the rear compartment to examine the right track when the bear made its presence known. It emerged from the tree line with shocking speed, a blur of brown fur and raw power that seemed impossible for something so large. The animal crashed into the side of the snowcat with such force that the entire vehicle rocked violently on its suspension. Sergei, who had been standing near the front of the vehicle, was immediately thrown against the metal frame by the impact. He crumpled to the ground as the bear continued its assault, using its massive paws to batter the snowcat's exterior. Dmitry tried to scramble back into the vehicle, but found himself pinned between the bear's bulk and the rear compartment door. The animal's hot breath created clouds of vapor that mingled with the falling snow as it bit and clawed at anything within reach. Inside the cab, Yulia grabbed the emergency flare kit, her hands shaking as adrenaline surged through her. She managed to ignite one and tossed it through the partially open window, the bright red flame sputtering in the wind. Alexei, still in the rear compartment, seized a metal pry bar and began hammering it against the interior walls, creating a cacophony of noise that he hoped would drive the animal away. Elena had fallen when the bear first struck, and now found herself sprawled in the snow several meters from the vehicle. She could see the bear's massive form as it continued to attack, could hear the terrible sounds of metal bending, and the animal's guttural growls. She tried to crawl further away, but her legs refused to cooperate, shock and cold already beginning to shut down her body's responses. The attack continued for what felt like hours, but was likely only 10 or 12 minutes. Alexei continued banging on every metal surface he could reach, while Yulia lit additional flares and threw anything she could find through the windows. The bear circled the snowcat repeatedly, occasionally rearing up on its hind legs to bring its full weight down on the vehicle's roof. Eventually, perhaps exhausted or simply losing interest, the bear withdrew. It moved back into the forest with surprising silence, disappearing into the swirling snow as suddenly as it had appeared. The aftermath was devastating. Sergei lay motionless in the snow near the front of the vehicle, his injuries catastrophic from both the initial impact and the extreme cold. Dmitry remained pinned against the rear compartment, having succumbed to blunt force trauma and exposure. Elena, though conscious when Yulia and Alexei reached her, died from hypothermia before they could get her into whatever shelter the damaged snowcat could provide. The two survivors huddled together in the cab, using the emergency radio to call for help. The response took nearly 4 hours due to the weather conditions and remote location. When the rescue team finally arrived, they found Alexei and Yulia suffering from severe frostbite and psychological trauma, but alive. The bear had vanished into the vast taiga, and tracking it in the conditions proved impossible. The incident sent shockwaves through the logging industry in the Amur region. Investigations revealed that the area where the attack occurred had experienced intensive logging, displacing several bear families from their traditional territories, just as they were preparing for winter. The early snowfall compounded the problem by limiting food sources and forcing the animals to range farther in search of sustenance. Alexei and Yulia both required extensive medical treatment for their frostbite injuries, with Alexei losing parts of 3 fingers to the cold. Neither returned to forestry work, both citing the psychological impact of watching their colleagues die while being unable to help them effectively. The tragedy served as a brutal reminder that, even with modern equipment and safety protocols, the Russian wilderness remained a place where nature's power could overwhelm human preparations in an instant, especially when human activity disrupted the delicate balance that allowed humans and massive predators to coexist in the same territory.